As Joe mentioned, my name is Michaela Blackham, and I am the Accessibility and QA Specialist here at Atten Design Group. I entered into the workforce as an interactive designer before moving into the development world full time as of about 2020, or back in the day. And then as of 2020, I moved into the full accessibility specialist role here at Atten to really make a difference in our process, build a partnership with the Blind Institute of Technology, and educate others on the importance of creating accessible products and services. But many people have asked how I got involved with this so early. It's been about 4 or 5 years now that I've been part of the accessibility community and why this has been so important to me. I grew up with a cousin my age with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and watched how she was able to do her homework, navigate the internet, or even just listen to music on her iPod, all with little to no mobility and difficulty speaking loud enough for talk to type programs like Dragon or Siri. Sometimes she had to get very creative, but most of the time she had to ask for help, which I know frustrated her immensely. And I always wanted to relieve her of that stress. So I got involved with both physical and digital accessibility. But really, focusing on accessibility of your site is important in order to relieve the stress of everyone using your site, not just people who may struggle with it a bit more, like my cousin Emily. So that's why we're here today. Today, we'll be going over Atten's approach to accessible web projects. This isn't necessarily a step by step guide, but will give you a better understanding on how to break up responsibilities, get your entire team involved to create a much smoother process and implementation. So let's talk about it. Why is accessibility so important? Well, there are a few key factors. According to the CDC, 61 million adults in the US live with some form of a disability. That's about 1 in 4 people, or 25% of your possible users on your website. If you think about it, search engines browse websites in a similar way as screen readers. The same methods we use to make accessible websites also make them easier for search engines to index. And having an inaccessible website can be extremely costly. We have seen this in a number of opportunities out there where higher education or universities have gotten sued over free videos and learning materials that may not have had captions, for example. No one is off limits. Even Queen Bee herself fell into trouble with her website in 2019. The blind and visually impaired community was unable to interact and access the primary portal of her website, creating quite the frenzy. And let's not forget Domino's Pizza, who was trying to take a case all the way to the Supreme Court where they were being sued for not having an accessible website. The Supreme Court was not on their side and ruled that Domino's also had to follow ADA guidelines just like everyone else. That picking up a phone to order a pizza is not the fix when you can just do so much online without even interacting with a human. They should supply the same experience for all users. But wait, I've heard about these amazing accessibility plugins and overlays. And shouldn't that fix all of our issues and save us from all of our legal downfalls? I've been getting this question a lot nowadays. A client or a developer has heard about this accessibility plugin like Accessibility or UserWay that will solve all of your problems in little to no time or money up front. They use artificial intelligence to fix your entire website of all errors and adds the plugin to customize your user's experience. And if you are not familiar with these widgets and overlays, here's an example. So here we have the Atten website. And if you look in the bottom right corner, you'll see there's a little red arrow pointing to this blue icon with the little person inside. It can look like a bunch of different things, but usually it's accessibility related. And there's an icon in the bottom left or right corner. And basically you would click on that button and then it brings up this pop-up. And here it gives you so many options, more adjustments than a user will ever really need to fit their customization. It doesn't require anyone going into your code and fixing anything. And JavaScript will fix everything on your site so it's compliant. Using this, you could change your font that you're using. You could scale up your content. You can highlight titles. You can highlight links. You can change the alignment. You can do everything. There's so many pieces there. Sounds amazing, right? Well, I know we've all heard this before, but if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. And in this case, it is. I know it has the right intentions and people are just scared about being sued, but implementing a process, getting a review, and implementing changes to improve your site can happen just a little bit at a time. Don't fall for all of these get accessible quick schemes. This is something we could go into a lot of detail about, but we have to go through a lot today. So it looks like we may have a future webinar on our hands. But anyways, the gist of it is a majority of the guidelines in WCAG actually cannot be fixed or detected with automated tools alone. Manual testing and human logic must always be applied. Screen readers, screen reader users will use their own proprietary software. I can guarantee that none of them will ever use this random plugin that you have on your site when they've been using something day after day, hour after hour. It just makes sense to stick with what they have. You need to customize your experience before you can even interact with the site. So you have to go in and maybe change the colors, you have to change the focus styles, you have to change the size, the contrast, everything. When in reality, your site should already just be up to standard so no one actually had to customize their experience to even interact with it. And every plugin is different. So there's Accessibility is the biggest one out there and they do a great job. However, if someone is using one of the lower level ones that might be completely different, having to go in and then customize everything again could be extremely difficult and it's extremely different. So there's that main learning curve there. One annoying part is that it takes focus away from screen readers if it's the first thing on the page. A lot of times they'll use a positive tab index, which will then gain focus right away on the page. And then it puts the whole website out of order. So if you're using a screen reader or keyboard, then you obviously have to go through the site in a different order than you were expecting. And sometimes too many options are not great. Just imagine going to the Cheesecake Factory. I feel like there's so many options there. I always just end up falling for chicken fingers because I really can't choose what I actually want. And then I'm pretty disappointed every time. Sometimes too many customizations have that same effect as well. And it costs a monthly subscription to have these. And yes, it might only be $20 a month, but if you're having to use that for years on end, that's going to add up. Sometimes just implementing the overall process from the beginning will actually save you money in the long term. And here's a great quote that from the Blind Institute of Technology. His name is Mike Hess. He's the founder and executive director there. We're partnered with them for our screen reader testing. And this is one of my favorite quotes that we've had about this whole issue is that website overlays hijack the user experience, attempting to display the site in a way it thinks is helpful to me. Many overlays sit at the top of the page and continuously send audio announcements to the screen reader, asking the user to engage the tool. These alerts constantly interrupt the audio when the web page is being read. And as you can see, it's actually creating more harm than good. It may deter some lawyers for now, but it doesn't actually change the structure of your site. If the code actually isn't changed, then your site is still inaccessible. So basically, we want to just know that there is no substitute for making digital accessibility an embedded part of your team culture. And that's why we're here today. So let's dive in and let's talk about some of the steps we can take to make your site more accessible. At Atten, we think a lot about how everyone on the team can help build accessible websites. Identifying who is responsible for what is important in making sure accessibility happens. But before we dive into each of the roles, I'm curious what roles we have here today. Joe, do you mind opening up the poll to let us know who is here today? Are you a project manager, designer, strategist, developer, content creator, or maybe just something that I haven't mentioned here that we can go over maybe after this presentation?
Okay, we're getting we just have one or two more, give it 1 or 2 more seconds. And okay.
Awesome. So it looks like we have a lot of developers and project managers, but it looks like we have someone from every part of the team there. We'll be diving into each one of these today. So let's talk about incorporating this into our teams. So where do we begin if we want to include accessibility team-wide? Well, with PMs, of course, the ensure projects are on time, on budget, and successful. But how does a project manager ensure accessibility is included in their projects? We want to make sure the client understands that what's involved in making accessible websites. So we want to make sure it's a priority from the beginning. More complex interactivity tends to require more time and budget for review. If you're including actual user testing for screen reader stamp of approval, this is going to also require more time for review. Scope, time, and budget are all factors to consider. And we want to establish checkpoints for each stage of the project. Checkpoints make sure the work is actually being done. So is design completed? Awesome. Let's review it for accessibility. Has a section of the website been built? Perfect. Let's review it for accessibility. Setting checkpoints ensure that the work is actually happening. So let's talk about strategists and architects. These are people who are actually creating the structure of the website and using wireframes and figuring out the user stories and everything of that sort. So first, we want to make sure we include people with disabilities in your key audiences. We want to make sure we're not leaving out 25% of your users. We want to define a logical order of content. Defining the logical order of content on each screen to be read by a screen reader or other assistive technologies. This also helps with mobile first design. This is focused on structuring content, helps identify the most important content on each page. It also dictates like how the content's going to be read on the page. If your sidebar, for instance, is on the left side of the page and your content is on the right, logically, you'll have to go through the sidebar first. So if you're jumping to the content and then the sidebar, it's not exactly following the logical order. So we want to pay attention to that. And this is where our first checkpoint would happen with strategy and accessibility. This is where I like to nail down the overall structure of the site for backend developers. This way, correct elements, headings, and structure will be documented for the development phase. Designers actually play a huge role in building a foundation for accessible websites. It isn't just made or used to make something look pretty. It's used to make something organized, easy to understand, and highly accessible. As designers, always push for completing and organizing the content before starting any design. A lot of times this will be happening in the strategy phase, but if you don't have that phase, this is where it should be happening. You want to push for the content. This enables you to create well-informed layout and hierarchy for every user. And you want to make sure you check your designs for color contrast. The wrong color combination or lack of contrast can be distracting or even confusing for people who are colorblind or have aging eyes. Sketch, Figma, and Photoshop all have ways to check your contrast. And there are plenty of free online tools to double check your hex options. Always pay attention to size of text as well, as that can play a big part in contrast. So let's use this as an example. Because a lot of people, we work in an agency and you might as well, that you might say, well, we have strict style guidelines that we need to follow, the strict color codes and everything. And we have that conversation all the time. And sometimes it really just is a conversation between you and the client and visual examples to show them how their style guide is not going to be changing much to make it more accessible. So here's a green that we have from a style guide. And unfortunately, it doesn't actually fit the contrast ratio. So we included this other green that's very similar. And as you can see here, it actually does pass the contrast ratio. So it's very similar. Maybe you see a difference, maybe you don't. So let's move it a little bit closer. Here you might be able to see a little bit more of a difference between the two. However, it's still not that big of a difference. And if you're thinking about text, text will not be having this drastic of a difference here because it's in a smaller portion, whereas this is a larger portion. So if it's a background color, yes, you might be able to see it, but you'll be able to play around with it a little bit more. So just by checking the contrast ratio and maybe tweaking as needed, you can make your site super accessible. We want to make sure we're not relying on color alone to show distinctions. Use color as a way to highlight or complement what is already visible. Add text, borders, or iconography to reinforce the color change if needed. A good example of this is, for instance, links on a page in the content area. Looking at this, all of it's pretty much the same, so you can't actually see what's a link and what's not. So a lot of people will just add a bright color in there so that you can see the links versus the text. But this, obviously, you can't just show color alone to show distinction. And that's an issue because if you are blue colorblind, I just changed it, and you can see if you're losing that blue deficiency there, you might not even be able to see the distinction between the link and the actual text. So by including that default underline for links is actually the best way to go. A lot of people may want to get rid of those links or the style there because they say it's a little outdated or they want to get a little creative. But honestly, this is just tried and true. This is what people expect, and it's a great way to do it. It's very simple. So when in doubt, always include the default here. Other common areas we see this color change, but no other change, so like no distinctive piece there, a lot are active states on menus where they might just include a change in color to show the active state. But if you are colorblind, you may not notice. So by including a background, an icon, or an underline is always a great direction there. Or for instance, if you're filling out a form and you forgot one of the fields, A lot of times I've seen just a red outline along or around the border of the input, but that's not enough to show distinction. The words error or maybe an icon with the X on there are needed so a user will actually know what the error is. We want to make sure we create clear, intuitive interfaces. White space will always be your friend. Clear, simple, intuitive user experiences are just inherently more accessible. Sorry. Test your designs. This means using some testing tools within your software or even asking some real life users for what they think. When I was a designer for a while, I would always ask my father, who was colorblind, his take on some of the pieces there, and I was able to find that human piece and see what it actually worked in real life. Modern design tools are making it easier than ever to test your designs. Developers ideally should not be adding in any kind of colors that may have a contrast issue. This should be resolved in the design phase, and designers should be setting developers up for success. And here's where our next checkpoint would happen with design and accessibility. Hopefully, this part is just getting a second set of eyes looking for any of those major issues. This is also a great time where we can document how this should be implemented for a front-end developer. And maybe we can find areas where we could be wary of issues that could arise from maybe animations, flashing and blinking, as well as maybe things related to cognitive issues. So let's talk about developers. Developers are responsible for ensuring the final website meets the standards set out at the start of the project. This tends to be what people think of most when they hear about creating accessible websites. This is one that gets incredibly technical, so I'm going to keep it pretty simple and just point out a couple of the few important items we should be paying attention to. First one, the correct use of hierarchy and structure with semantic markup creates a usable outline of content for screen readers to easily follow along. For example, screen readers can easily navigate a site through just links alone. So if you have a lot of learn mores on that page, they're going to be a little confused, but they can jump to every single link on the page. They can jump to any H2, any heading 3. They can jump to all the different lists, jump right to the footer, maybe the header, maybe the main element, maybe an aside, and so on. But if semantic markup isn't used, this becomes a more tedious task to explore a website. This also becomes an issue with interaction. If you're using a span in JavaScript to create something similar to what would be a button, instead of just using a button element, a screen reader and keyboard user may be locked out of this functionality altogether. Pay extra attention to markup on forms. Making sure placeholder attributes are not being used in place of label tags. That we group common elements like checkboxes within field sets. And then within that field set, we always include a legend. Every input must always have a distinctive label. So every input will have a label. And I'm saying distinctive because there are a number of times I'll look at a site and then maybe it's like a download page for PDFs and you can choose a number of PDFs to download at once. But if you were to look at what that label is for that checkbox for that download, it actually just says select this item. So if a screen reader was looking at the page, it just says select this item, select this item, select this item. It isn't very distinctive there. And if a user submits the form and there is an error, keyboard focus must be brought straight to that error so a screen reader doesn't have to go searching for it. Here's a quick example that we just want to make sure that there is a label with your input and that a placeholder is not a label. We need to make sure we plan for alternative text. Without alternative text, visually impaired users will have no idea what an image represents. Never use images for text. If your image is mostly text, then it should probably just be text. Never force alternative text for images in the CMS. Always allow for decorative images. Then you're saying, well, what if they don't fill it in? Then it's not going to have any alternative text at all. That's where developers come in, and we need to make sure we always have a fallback. And that fallback would just be an empty alternative alt attribute on the image element in the code. That way, if there is that empty alt attribute, the screen reader can just skip that image altogether. Otherwise, the entire path to the image will be read to the screen reader. We want to make sure we set our content editors up for success. This can be a little out of control when we are working with the CMS because the content editors are actually putting everything in. But there are a few things we can do to set them up for success. For instance, we can make sure there is a fallback for empty alternative attributes in the image element if a content editor deems this decorative or forgets alternative text altogether. We need a field to allow for captions or description fields for large complex charts and videos. We need to make sure the editor has all components included in their WYSIWYG. So we want to make sure all heading styles are there, lists are there, links, that if they need various stylings for a heading, maybe they want a couple options for the look of a heading too. We need to include those styles in there so that they can make the right decisions for accessibility. And we recommend adding a module that allows for content editors to check for accessibility issues in their content. If you have a Drupal 8 or 9 site, we recommend the CK Editor Accessibility Checker. This enables the content editor to double check their content for accessibility issues before pushing and for pushing and publishing, and it does a really amazing job. I'll go into a little bit more detail about this when we get to the content editors, but it's fairly easy to add to the site, and that's something we can all do. We want to make sure we include ARIA attributes. ARIA roles, properties, and states describe a section or functionality that wouldn't make sense to a screen reader. Just remember that ARIA conveys semantic information about components, structures, and behaviors. Just because you give something a role doesn't make it function any different. It just conveys what it is going to do. So for example, just because you give an item a role of menu doesn't magically make it function like a menu. It just conveys to the screen reader that this navigation is a menu. Another good example I always bring up has to do with people adding the role button to, again, maybe a span tag so that the screen reader is going to hear that it's a button, but interacting with it is going to be a little different. Maybe that role button is on a link, but links and buttons are interacted with differently to a screen reader. So we have to keep that in mind. This could be an entire presentation on its own. Again, it gets fairly technical, so I'll just touch upon some of the more important aspects of using ARIA. If you assign an ARIA role button to a span, and this doesn't automatically make it a button, so ARIA does not change the element's functionality. This is huge for screen readers because when you add these roles onto things like a span, it may not even gain focus or interact with a screen reader as expected. They might be locked out of that functionality. This brings me to my next one. If you are assigning a role to an element that doesn't align with the role, then your code is probably incorrect. So my example is that a role button to something that isn't actually a button element, then it's probably incorrect. So a lot of times, again, I'll see a role button on a span when in reality, that should just end up being a button element. So you want to make sure if you're seeing that conflict there, then you need to change your semantic code to make it actually work. One big thing is it's better to use semantic markup in no ARIA than it is to use incorrect ARIA. And that brings me to my next one, that more ARIA is not always better. I've heard this a lot from developers. I feel like it came in at one point that, oh, ARIA is great for screen readers, so you're putting it everywhere. However, if you're adding incorrect ARIA or adding too much, then the screen reader becomes a little bit too verbose, and then they're hearing too many items there. And especially if you're adding too much, you're probably doing it incorrectly as well. So not only are they going to be confused, but they're not going to be able to interact with your site quite as you expected. So if you are going to be using ARIA, these are the ones that I think are the most important. ARIA current, I think, is a great one for navigation items, for example. So you add maybe an active state to your nav item, but obviously that's not conveyed to a screen reader. ARIA current, you can say it's a current menu item, nav item, a list item, a link item, a tab, et cetera, and it will at least let the user know that you are on the current page. ARIA has pop-up and expanded are great for items like drop-downs, maybe a Hamburg menu, maybe any kind of mobile item there, so that the ARIA has pop-up is letting the screen reader know that this is going to have more information appear, and ARIA expanded true or false is letting the screen reader know if it is expanded or not expanded at that time. Describe by is a great one as well, because you'll be able to have those long descriptions for a chart or a graph, and you can say exactly what it's described by so they know exactly where to go to get more information. And ARIA Live is another great one. For instance, if you have a filter that's run by JavaScript. So if you filter down some content and it doesn't refresh the page but uses Ajax instead, this is a way to be able to announce to the screen reader that content has actually changed on the page. And we want to pay attention to focus styles. Does your element have a focus style on it when you use your keyboard to navigate the site? Focus styles also follow contrast rules as well. So if you are using a yellow outline on your focus style, but then you also have white background, black background, and maybe even a yellow background on your site, you may not see that yellow outline throughout the entire site. The ability to, you want to make sure that it works everywhere throughout your entire site on every single background. So we tend to recommend to use the default browser style, as the user has the ability to change it for what works best for them in that instance. So that's, for instance, Chrome with that blue kind of fuzzy outline that goes along everything. That's kind of the recommended direction you should go in. And next, you want to make sure you test your work. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about this, but when you're testing your work, you're using automated tools like Wave or Pally to check to make sure that you're actually including all the labels, no skipped headings, and so on and so on. But then you also want to manually check your work. You don't have to go too in depth if you're not too sure how to do that, but you should be able to navigate your site through just the tab button on your keyboard, or shift tab if you want to go backwards. Sometimes space, enter, and the arrow keys are also necessary as well, but anyone can do this. And here's where our next checkpoint would be with developers and accessibility. A checkpoint here is mostly just a gut check that the dev testing is accurate. More in-depth manual testing is usually involved here for more interactive items as well. Most of the time when I'm doing an accessibility review, I find that most of the issues are related to content on the page and not actually in the development. Clients tend to be the content creators in our case, and it's important for them to know how their content can meet accessibility standards. So we want to make sure that we include meaningful alternative text for images, and we also include descriptions for charts and graphs. So one thing with that is alt text should always convey information that is equivalent to the meaning or purpose of the image, while also staying as succinct as possible. I recommend usually under 10 words, but obviously there's give and take for whatever you think is best. But I would try not to exceed that. You also have to pay attention to the context of the image, because a picture of something that you have on your site could be a completely different meaning depending on what it's describing. So you should be paying attention to that. So a good example I always use there is like a picture of a football team in a huddle. It could just be a simple football team in huddle before game. But if that picture is on a page for football signups, you could say something related to football players on a team getting or signing up for their team or something of that sort. It could be, you could have a little bit more fun with that there. One rule of thumb is if there are words or text in it, the text should say exactly what the image says. So my example there is if you look at the bottom of this page, you'll see @ Design Group, and technically that's our whole logo. So in that sense, we would just have @ Design Group as the alternative text. We never want to include image of, graphic of, logo of, and so on in the alternative text, because it's just going to reiterate exactly what the screen reader is saying anyway, since they will say image @ Design Group. Otherwise, it can be annoying to hear image of @ Design Group. And a reminder that long charts and graphs should be described in captions and descriptions following the image, and not actually within the alternative text. We want to make sure whoever is looking at that chart or graph will actually have the information it needs. And as you know, we don't want to exceed more than 10 words, so we need to make sure that that information is elsewhere. WebAIM has a great article here, and this is, they'll go over a lot of the context part as well. That's great for alternative text and how to write it. So I definitely recommend checking that out after this. We want to use headings to organize and structure your content. Writing for web is different than writing for print. An infinite canvas can lead to lengthy content. You want to educate your clients on best practices for writing content outline and using proper heading hierarchy to structure the content. For example, heading 2s should only ever follow heading 1s. And you should never skip from an H2 to an H4 just because it looks nice. Paragraphs should never be used as headings, because someone will not be able to skip around and actually skip to the various headings because they're actually paragraphs. Basically, the content editor needs to follow the correct structure and not the size or the look of the heading. The content editor will like a smaller H2 available, then you should communicate to your designer or developer to implement this into your WYSIWYG. And write descriptive calls to actions. Basically, a good rule of thumb is we want to avoid learn more, never write click here, things of that sort. As mentioned before, screen readers can look at the page by links alone. If you have 7 learn mores on the page, they're going to have to go to that, learn more, and then kind of do some context clues and search around to find the latest heading that would describe what it's talking about. And it becomes very frustrating. So here I would do something similar to, instead of to learn about the history of HTML, click here, you would keep it as just history of HTML. That way, if a screen reader was to come to the page, they will know exactly what that link is going to. We want to provide captions, transcripts, and descriptions for media. We want to allow all audio enabled items should have some kind of fallback, whether it is closed captioning that follows along with the video or transcripts a user can look at instead of the visual. We want to check your work with the CK Editor Accessibility Checker before publishing. And as mentioned, we have this for Drupal 8 and 9 components, but it's something that the dev should be adding to the site if it's available for you. And it's something that I really enjoy. So all you will do is, in that top left corner, you'll see that little accessibility icon, similar to that plugin one that we talked about before. And it will find all issues related to errors or warnings. So it will be things like creating a list that isn't actually a semantic list in the code, like the one that's highlighted down below. Someone just wrote 1 parenthesis intuitive user interface and then 2 same thing, when in reality it should be a list element. So it's warning you about that. It will look for skipped headings, vague links, or if you see here, you can see accessibility checker is here. That's paragraph bolded to look like a heading, and it will warn you of that issue as well. If you're one of our clients looking to add this to your site, feel free to reach out, and this could set you guys up for success pretty easily. And this is where a majority of my work comes in as the accessibility specialist. Not only do I create the accessibility plan for the current project, but I will be the one doing thorough testing and facilitating the screen reader testing. I'll be prioritizing feedback and issues from those tests, and I'll be supplying the solution for the fix. So if it's a content editor issue, if it's a designer issue, a developer, but also because I have the design and development background, I can absolutely give the solution that is necessary for a quick turnaround. So at this point, we want to make sure we test at every stage of the project. We kind of talked about this before. It should be done by every person in the chain of operations. For instance, design will finish their work and have tests for contrast and logical order, but then I will jump in before final approval to help make sure everything we're doing are meeting standards. Performing this at every stage also helps better prepare developers or content editors for what their tasks at hand may be. We want to run automated tests using Wave, Site Improve, or automated testing with like Pally or your command line. There's plenty of tools out there. This will catch code-related issues like contrast, missing form labels, and so on. It's something you could do manually, but why would you? It would take so long. It's super tedious. This can also be done in command line, as I mentioned, like we use Pally, or can be hand done by absolutely anyone using the Wave tool. Here's an example of the Wave tool. I definitely recommend this for anyone starting out because it's free, and there's an extension that you can actually add to your browser. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's one right here. And you can use it with little to no technical skills. It's definitely recommended for first timers as you start getting used to it. So you'll see the wave.webaim down there. And just remember that automated tools will only catch maybe about a third of the total issues on your site. Most testing must be manually done and must apply human logic for issues and solutions. So remember, a review is never completed unless a manual test is completed. This involves basic keyboard navigation as well as screen reader testing. Anyone can do automated and simple manual keyboard testing, but it's always best to have users who use assistive technology as an extension of their everyday life run screen reader tests. As mentioned, we partner with BIT, the Blind Institute of Technology, for our screen reader testing for the most accurate feedback. And with a lot of our clients, we launch a website and continue to work with them after the fact in consulting. Planning for an accessibility audit is a great way to ensure that we've met standards at the beginning of the project and that they're still being met. And finally, we want to make sure we include an accessibility statement. It should be the first thing anyone and everyone includes on their site. There are many free accessibility statement builders out there, and if you are worried or know of issues on your site, I would recommend adding this as your first step in your digital accessibility journey. Well, why are we doing this? Because really it's the first line of defense. It tends to be the first thing lawyers look for. Accessibility statements are also recommended to be found on every site in an extremely easy to find spot. So most of the time it's found in the footer with just an accessibility link. And the point of it is just to tell the user important information about the quality of your site. So things that should be included in your accessibility statement are the guidelines that you're following. You should be warning the user of any major issues that you may be encountering. Maybe when you did a simple keyboard test, you realized that your mobile menu can't be accessed by keyboard, or maybe your drop downs, or maybe a carousel. So you definitely want to be truthful and let them know about that. You want to let them know when the issues will be resolved. If you're finding a lot of issues, then something needs to happen. So you can put in a date for when it will be resolved. You want to include any preferred technology to navigate the site, if there is anything, or even maybe technology limitations. Maybe you did testing, you found out it doesn't work on Safari on tablet, for instance. You would want to recommend or include that in there so that they can have the best experience. And then you obviously want to include contact information for the user. This way they know that they can contact you by phone and email. You always want to include both of those so that everyone can access your site and get their point across, or maybe request an alternative form of the information if needed right away. So here's the question. It's wonderful for larger teams, everything that we've talked about, and for current in progress projects. But what if you just launched your website? Or what if you just created yourself a website on Squarespace or WordPress or something? And that's totally fine. The important step is to make the first effort towards ADA compliance. If this is relevant to you, in the process from team role to team role doesn't make sense in the stage of the project, I would suggest diving right in and doing what you can on your own. There is actually a lot you can test without major accessibility background. So first, you want to make sure you use that wave tool to check for automated issues for easy changes. Most of the time, it should hopefully be content related. Maybe you have to change some contrast issues, or maybe you're finding some issues within the form that you can easily change within your WordPress or Squarespace site, for example. Next, you want to use your keyboard to navigate your site. You want to go forward and backwards. If you can interact with something with your mouse, you need to be able to interact with it with your keyboard. A good simple rule of thumb is simplify any interactive elements that you may have. Does your site need to have a drop down menu? If it doesn't, try to simplify it. Do you need to have an image carousel? Your answer is probably no one should ever really need an image carousel. Put it in a simple gallery that's all on the page. Carousels tend to be very inaccessible. Does this element show more information on hover only? This is something I see a lot that's very frustrating. Let's say you have a list of schools, and every time you hover over the school, it gives contact information or a little bit more information will appear over the picture of the school, for example. If that information is only found on hover, you need to remove it from that hover action, and it should ideally be already on that page. You want to only use tables for actual tabular data, not for structuring. And make sure you add an accessibility statement. This is the easiest and quickest thing to add to your site. Be truthful about your current situation and supply contact information, remember phone and email, so someone can help your user right away. Remember that a majority of issues are more likely content editor related. This is something we can all fix with little to no help from the outside world. Small steps towards a more accessible website will actually just help everyone. And if this all seems overwhelming to you, or if you think you need a bit more knowledge and help to get your accessibility needs in place, Atten is here to help. We can help run reviews, help facilitate user testing, create accessibility statements, or help train your team. But thanks for joining me today.